Hello everyone and welcome to another exciting session of the LambdaTest XP series. Through XP series, we dive into the world of insights and innovation featuring renowned testing industry experts and business leaders in the QA ecosystem. I'm 𝐁𝐨š𝐭𝐣𝐚𝐧, Director of Product Marketing at LambdaTest, and I'll be your host for this session on mitigating flaky tests in CI/CD suite. Before we begin, let me introduce you to our guest, Bostjan 𝐁𝐨š𝐭𝐣𝐚𝐧, Developer Relations at Semaphore. Bostjan is a seasoned engineer who transitioned into DevRel, boasting a rich background in tackling engineering challenges across startups and enterprises. With a passion for community building and knowledge sharing, Bostjan brings wealth of experience to the QA community and does so by coaching students as well. Hey Bostjan, thank you so much for joining us. So glad to have you here.
Having me. It's great to be here.
Perfect. So in today's webinar, we'll dive into the world of flaky tests from an engineering perspective. Bostjan will help us, get the enlightenment on understanding the root causes of flaky tests, various detection techniques, and effective mitigation, and also management strategies to help keep flaky tests at bay, especially why it's super important to keep an eye out on your CI/CD pipeline while you have all the other things set up. So, Bostjan, we'll start this talk real quick, right? And one question I would like to shoot up, where do you find these flaky tests, right? Where do they come from? And what practices would you recommend to keep them at bay?
So, of course, the answer on a low level is like really simple, right? The flaky tests come from your code. And it's not necessarily your testing code. It can be some code that's outside of your tests, and that code is basically dependent upon the test that you're running. Mostly it comes like from two factors, right? One is the people factor, which, let's say I was one of the engineers that was part of this, let's say, ignore the flaky test concept because I didn't know what they were at some point in my engineering career. Mm-hmm. And the other factor is basically tech-based, right? So there are parts of your code that don't necessarily run the way you want them to. And these parts are like usually tests that are dependent upon each other. So maybe one of those tests has failed and subsequently your other tests are failing as well because of that test. But it didn't necessarily fail because of something you did wrong. So one of the things is, for instance, like order dependency between your tests, right? So if something fails because of, I don't know, an infrastructure problem or something like that, then your other tests will fail as well. So this is basically the first root cause you can find. And for that, you can like use mocks and stubs. So a real life example, for instance, would be if you're communicating with Stripe, and okay, Stripe will almost always be accessible, right? But maybe if it's some obscure service that you're using in your tests, maybe they have timeouts, maybe they don't work at the moment. And this can basically affect your test suite, right? And because of that, your test will fail. But it won't fail because of your business logic, it will fail because of some other dependency that's currently not working. And for that, what we do is we provide mocks and stubs, right? And we use those instead. Mm-hmm. But if something isn't working a lot of the time that you're using, maybe you should also think about replacing that part of your code, right? And basically that's one of the things, right? One of the other things are tests that are reliant upon timeouts or retries, right? So maybe there's a part of your code that communicates with a certain API. Or for instance, you have webhooks or something similar, right? And you want to check if that webhook was delivered with some sort of test. And of course, we have some sort of retry functionality over there, right? And we need to have like, let's say, a fixed number of retries or something like that. And if those fail, then your test did fail. But maybe there's another cause why the test failed, right? So there's one thing. And another thing is your environment. So I can give you a real life example. So when I was working on a blockchain project, for instance, locally, my tests would work fine. I was using a local, I don't even remember what it's called, but something that mocked the blockchain, right? And it worked perfectly fine. And when I ran it in the test environment, my tests were failing randomly. So sometimes it would go through, sometimes it wouldn't. And the solution at that point in time, because obviously I didn't have the time to fix it, was just to rerun them. And they magically went through, right? And this is like one of those things that can affect your test suites as well. So inconsistency between your environments. So you have to make sure that your local environment, staging, testing, whatever it is you call it, they need to be like consistent. And this is also a root cause of flakiness, right? And yeah, of course, I talked about dependencies there. Like you need to isolate your tests. You don't want a lot of dependencies between them because that can like cause havoc. I'm sure you can also tell me about war stories regarding that as well.
I'm pretty sure that the audience would be relating it to their own dark side of episode around flaky tests. Pretty much everybody encounters it at some point on the other end. It has been a headbanger, honestly saying. But yeah, I am pretty sure that happens with somebody, at some point of life. If you are in the QA, you're bound to face them.
Yeah, of course. But yeah, basically, I mean, just to put it simply, for your code base, you need to ensure to put it in a ChatGPT way, deterministic behavior. And that basically means your code needs to be concise. It needs to follow the same scenario the whole time you're like running your testing suites. Mm-hmm. And of course, just to summarize it, always use mocks and stubs and make sure you mock any external dependency that you have, because that can lead to flakiness if that external service doesn't work. And that can also be like an internal service as well, right? So if you're in a microservice-based architecture, maybe some of the microservices currently aren't working or someone is fixing something on them, right?
Right.
That can also like lead to your test suites failing, and then,
Speaking of failing, how do you differentiate between genuinely failing tests versus flaky tests using, your detection techniques? What are some key metrics or indicators that, you might be using for this purpose?
This section is a bit of a black hole, right? So there's like a lot of techniques that you can use. The basic one is basically the rerun strategy. That's like the dummified way of checking if any of your test is flaky, right? So for instance, just like I was talking about it before, you like run your tests locally, they work, you run them in your testing environment, they fail, and you're like, okay, let's try rerunning them. And then they magically work and you ignore the error and go on. So one detection technique is basically the rerun strategy. So you rerun them and see if they pass or not. So for a test on the same code base, if it like once it goes through, the second time it doesn't, and then it again goes through, doesn't, that's something you need to like have like an eye on. So that's like one of the things that's like the pure behavior of flakiness, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is like historically checking what was going on with that same test through other commits, right? So if that test hasn't changed, maybe on a different branch, it had like a different behavior. So here we're again in that dependency analysis mode, right? So if your tests are dependent, then this can happen. But yeah, one aspect of detecting them is also like using machine learning techniques. I'm going to be quite frank. I don't know a lot about machine learning techniques for flaky test detection, but of course, everything is reliant upon data that you have. So for instance, I'm sure LambdaTest collects a lot of data about tests, right? Throughout running them all the time. And that's the data you can use to then like detect if a certain test is flaky or not. So
as a matter of fact, at LambdaTest, we do have a proposition which comes as test intelligence, which helps you deal, with these flaky tests. You can actually see the trends at which your tests are failing. Your tests are even categorized based on the error classification. So you're able to deep dive and see that historical trend. Okay, this passed one time in a week, failed 3 times in the same week. The next week it's floating at, pass rate of 4 times. And then those false positives and negatives you can measure using test intelligence at LambdaTest. So yes.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all about the data around your test suites, right? And speaking about this, there's also, I haven't talked about time-based analysis, right? So,
Yes.
for instance, okay, one test can, in one instance, run like, I don't know, let's say 30 seconds. I'm making it up. But in another instance, it could run like 10 minutes and not go through, right?
Yeah.
This is also something that could be flaky. But again, this is that black box area I was talking about, right?
Right.
Maybe some part of your infrastructure is currently working very, very slow. And the test that's dependent upon that, well, it's just needed more time to run in that case, right? So that's why this part, so time-based analysis, needs to basically connect to everything we've talked about before, right? So it's important to have all of the data at your hands to detect if a test is flaky or not. And maybe your analysis will fail. That's why you need to look through your history to see if a test is flaky or not. So in one scenario where you've only ran this suit once or twice, maybe, you can't necessarily say, hey, this is like a flaky test, right? Maybe there are other factors involved. That's why this whole area is basically a black box, and that's why machine learning is like a good tool to use to detect.
And I believe that is why I believe that is why you pressed on the logic of rerunning the test, right? Because the more data you have, the more you're able to swiftly pinpoint, okay, this is why it's happening, because it depends upon how much volume you're seeing in terms of failure or pass rate, right? So, of course, that helps. You also touched briefly on test environment stability, right, and infrastructure. So, would just like you to touch more around that area as to, the role of the environment stability and infrastructure reliability in terms of reducing the occurrence of flaky tests.
Yeah, so for this area, I can present my expertise around how this affects your CI/CD process. But basically, if it affects your CI/CD process, then it affects your environments, right? Because you always want to deliver the latest code, always want to have the latest QA environment for your testers to test on, or maybe for automated tests to be run on. So if you have maybe just one flaky test in your test suite, who cares? It's going to fail once, maybe you'll rerun that pipeline and it will go through. But for larger apps, you can have thousands of tests. And if a few of them are flaky and present this sort of behavior, sort of working, not working, and you start rerunning your workflows, this will basically take your time, so your build time, away from you, because you'll be rerunning your tests all the time.
Right.
And if you're taking away time, you're taking away money. Depends on whether you're running your pipelines and workflows, right? And it's not just time and money, it's also the engineers that are working on these projects. So if they can't get those instant feedback loops, right? And I don't know, some sort of feedback whether their code is performing well or not, then that leads to massive frustration, right?
Yes.
And that's why you basically need to eliminate flaky tests from your test suites as soon as possible, because this will basically lead you into a process where you spend less time and less money for all of the workflows that you're doing, right? Because big companies, they don't deploy once per day. Each commit that goes in, the pipeline runs, it takes time. And I don't know, if we are talking about a company that has 1,000 employees and 500 of them are engineers, and they do at least 2 commits per day, maybe, or 1, that's 500 workflows being triggered, right? And if 250 of them just say, oh, we're not going to pass, and then they rerun them, well, that then leads to losing time again and money.
And I believe faster feedback loop, as you just said, right, it's super critical. And I believe everybody is aware that, the later you found a bug, the more it's going to cost you.
Yeah, exactly.
It's obvious, right? And speaking, you also touched upon money and time, right? And life of a modern QA, let's be honest, it's never easy, right? With all the existing things to keep in check and the new requirements coming in on weekly, bi-weekly basis, right? There's a lot to be done, right? So how do we prioritize and address flaky tests on top of that, right? While being time sensitive and,
So yeah, of course. I mean, first, of course, you need to like know which of the tests are actually flaky. And I'm not going to say maybe the stupidest technique, but let's say the easiest technique to use. So if you're in a rush and you really need to deploy that code or test it out, one of the approaches is to actually isolate those tests. So the ones that are flaky, just isolate them. But you also need to be cautious about that, right? So if it's some important part of your business logic, right? Like, I don't know, I'm making stuff up as I go along, but let's say that you're like checking if some sort of money transaction is going through or not. Obviously, that's important. You can't just comment it out and isolate it, right?
All right.
But if it's like a stupid check, okay, and when I say stupid, I'm saying it in quotation marks, right? If the color on the interface is yellow, when I press the yellow button, okay, sure, we can like isolate this one out and find out later why this is causing us flakiness, right?
Right.
And yeah, isolation is basically the first thing you can actually do. And of course, it really depends on if you're in a rush or not, right? So isolation is good, but usually what you need to do, so if a lot of your tests are flaky, you need to find out why they're flaky. And then usually dependency scanning comes in mind, right? And code analysis if tests are dependent upon each other and stuff like that. And of course, you can use external tooling for that, right? So SonarQube is quite good at scanning your code and giving you suggestions and also analyzing tests. And of course, each big company that has larger test suites uses something, either you guys, right? Or I don't know, the other solutions that are out there like Cypress and stuff like that. You need to like look at those tools, their suggestions, and basically eliminate the flakiness of your test. So usually the root cause will be the code itself. So you need to like make a plan and strategize around that. So the tests that are, so if the flaky test is some really important business logic, like the money transactions I was talking about, of course you need to like put this as a higher priority before any features are released and eliminate that as soon as possible. So yeah, it's all about strategizing. I mean, there's no like common approach or magical tool that can do that for you, but you need to like do this from the start, basically. You need to be aware of what flaky tests are and what they do to your team and start from the beginning, right? So each new project you do, be aware of that this exists and how to eliminate it from the start. But if you're like deep down into something, at least start eliminating those that are kind of causing those big time eruptions, right? So for instance, if some test takes more time for the test suites to go through, start eliminating that one before the other ones.
Got it.
Those that are like time sensitive and have like the highest critical rate, you should solve those first. And yeah, of course, depends on how your workflow is, right? But yeah, usually you start with the ones that are the most critical, right?
I mean, it is flaky tests and you can't expect them to be consistent. So
yeah, of course.
handling method is also going to vary from business to business cases. But yes, of course, prioritization, as you said, it cannot be something you can do it has to be done based on your business scenario, right? What exactly is failing is something you need to define a priority for, right?
Of course.
And speaking of, implications of flaky tests, what do you think are some of the implications on software maintenance and technical debt?
Yeah, so of course, for software maintenance, it basically already relates to the answers we were giving before this question, right? It's basically the same. So the more flaky tests that you have in your test suites, the harder it's going to be to maintain them.
Right.
I mean, maintain your code, because this basically means that, as we've already talked about, your feedback loops are slower. Any process that you do is slower. Any new code that you deploy is like slower. And this is like the biggest bottleneck that you have.
Vicious cycle.
Right? It's like, as you've put it, it's a vicious cycle that just doesn't stop. And the longer you keep ignoring it, it's going to like grow exponentially. Because let's say you have a test that is flaky and your test suite runs for, I don't know, 40 minutes, right? That's like a really large one. And maybe one of those tests is flaky in there and your test suite fails and you rerun it and then it magically goes through. You've just spent 80 minutes to deploy something, right? And this is something you really want to eliminate, to not be a part of. That's why we want to remove this as soon as possible, because it really has a high impact on how you do your work. And at Semaphore, basically, when we were doing like an analysis of this, right? So because we are focused on CI/CD, we provide a CI/CD platform for you. We do have a lot of metrics in the background. So how fast are your pipelines? What are the average times? What are the bottlenecks? Stuff like that, right? And we were checking it out. So for instance, test suites that go through, usually you start with optimizing those, right?
Right.
And you try to keep the times of your tests minimal. So you want to optimize them. But in the end, we figured out that those optimizations might lower your times, but flaky tests are like the biggest bottleneck in the end. Even if you fix some sort of test that's like really slow or does some calculations and you optimize the algorithm behind it and it's faster, well, that's like nothing compared to having flaky tests in your test suites, because this is like a massive bottleneck. It stops your pipeline. You need to rerun it. You need to rerun your test suites. That's like, it has a way bigger impact than any of the other tests that you want to like optimize or solve, right?
Right.
That's why this is like a pretty important thing. And that's why we decided to tackle it, at least on a CI/CD level, to give you like an overview.
Right. So considering how alarming these flaky tests are, right? What is, how do you find these flaky tests is the biggest question.
Yeah, so finding them, we've already like talked about this, like using certain tools that help you find those flaky tests and using the data that helps you find them. But yeah, I can showcase in this part, since you've like posted the question, how our dashboard helps you like find these tests, right?
Yeah.
And let's go into, hopefully, a successful screen share mode. So, okay, this is like our flaky test dashboard, right? And of course, here at the top part, we have certain filters that allow you to filter out the data that you have. And I won't be doing a deep dive into this. So the important things that you need to know is the disruptions, the number of disruptions that a certain test causes.
Right.
And of course, you can order them here, right, in our interface. And the disruption history as well. So an important metric is how many broken builds you've had. And that's like, this was one of the root causes we were talking about. This is something that like really gives you like, a lot of time waste, right? And here in this dashboard, you can see how flaky tests affect your build. So this is like a, let's say, fake scenario, right? And you can see that the more flaky tests that you have, the more broken builds you have. And these broken builds really have an impact on how much time you're spending on your CI/CD builds, right?
Right.
And yeah, this is just one tool that you can use to detect flaky tests. So we're focused on giving you like an overview of which of your tests are failing, how it affects your CI/CD pipeline, your build times, your pipeline performance, your workflow performance, stuff like that. And here in our interface, you can basically just do actions. So create a ticket for each test, which links to either a result that you have in some external tooling, like LambdaTest, for instance, or maybe a Jira ticket or something, right? And then you can mark it as solved once you've solved it. But the important metrics are also inside a specific test, right? So you can do like a deep dive and you can see in the last 30 days, for instance, for this certain test, you can see how many disruptions it has caused, what's the impact on your test suite, and what's the pass rate of your pipeline because of like this flaky test, right? And you can also see the duration as well. But this is like the important data. And when we were talking about, right, how to plan on solving them, this is just one of the things that can help you out. So our dashboard doesn't give you insights into, hey, this test was flaky because it has an external dependency or stuff like that. But it gives you an overview on which tests impact your CI/CD process the most. So the tests that obviously have a lot of flakiness in them will affect your pipeline performance and also your CI/CD process. And this is like what our flaky test dashboard focuses on. So what kind of effect it has on your pipeline performance and consequently your workflows as well, right? Because in the end of the day, your software delivery is dependent upon you having a successful pipeline that basically delivers this software to your customers, right?
Right.
And yeah, as said, this gives you an overview. And if you want, of course, you also need to use external tools that give you maybe more insight into each test, why it performed poorly, does it have any static dependencies or stuff like that.
Yeah. And then, of course, at the age of AI, we too have been incorporating a lot of features with the help of AI to help mitigate flaky tests with folks who are running their automation suites across LambdaTest platform, right? One such feature is, of course, AI-based RCA, which gives you an automatically generated root cause analysis, of course. And that has been a major productivity booster because a lot of times there are these humongous test suites and a simple syntactical error could also take up a lot of time for somebody to dig down as to where it happened and why it did, right?
Yeah, of course. As I've told you, our focus was, so for instance, when you have like a lot of external tooling in when you're like analyzing your code or doing your code or whatever, usually if you have big engineering teams, sometimes you just let things slide along if you're in a rush, right? And in this case, our focus was just to give you an overview of your performance, right? Of your pipeline performance, and not kind of develop a feature that fixes the code on its own, right? Because we focused on this part. That's why we have you guys. Right. So, because usually when people trigger their workflows, they check their pipeline performance, if they went through and stuff like that, right? And if you have like an eyesight into what's happening, so like you can just click on flaky tests and see this overview, you can see, oh, okay, now guys, we need to like start solving this because I can see that we're spending too much money, too much time, too much resources just because some of these tests are like behaving randomly, Right. And yeah, in the age of AI, of course, you can like use a lot of code scanners and stuff like that that give you suggestions on why something might be behaving as badly as it is.
Right. And of course, those visual representations are extremely critical, right? As you also showcased into the dashboard, that you see that over time, this is actually amounting to something that you've been ignoring in the past is actually leading to a lot of, extra waste in the future, right? Considering the other test failed at the same time, right? So yeah, of course, that helps.
People don't like to read, especially developers, because, each day, and I'm speaking from a personal perspective, right?
Right.
You always need to learn something new. You always need to read some documentation. And if you like run something, a workflow, and it gives you like a huge amount of text, and inside in there you see something red that says this test has failed, you usually tend to ignore it because it's a lot of info. But yeah, as you've said, if you have a visual representation, and at Semaphore we really like doing this because we know that it's not just developers, engineers, you also have like decision makers that want to have insight into what is happening all the time. We like doing these visual representations, right? Because from these you can actually, like in 10 seconds, maybe see what's going on.
Right.
Get instant feedback, and then you go into, oh, okay, guys, let's do a feature freeze now because this isn't going anywhere. We're wasting time. So let's stop doing features. Let's focus on fixing flaky tests as soon as possible.
That makes absolute sense. 100% visibility to all stakeholders at all times.
Yeah.
That is the major perk. So we talked a lot about handling flaky tests and managing them, but while we wrap this up, right, I would just like to ask your top advice for teams to, mitigate or handle flaky tests efficiently.
To be honest, if you rewatch this recording, that's basically it, right? I mean, we could go through it in a summarized sense, but in the end, I think it's important that teams are aware that flaky tests exist. Because usually, okay, but this is only based on my experience, right? Working with several teams. If you're doing a certain project for a startup, right? A prototype or something, you don't think about flaky tests and stuff like that, right? You think about doing the tests and then they run. I think it's just important to be aware as an engineering team that flaky tests do exist and what they actually are. Because usually some engineers don't know what flaky tests are. They don't even know that they exist. And this is like the first step, right? Before even doing a deep dive into all the technicalities and how-tos and whatnots, right? And this is like the first step. So let your engineers be aware of that this is a problem. It does exist and it can really kill your performance long-term, right? But yeah, that's basically it. So this is the human factor I forgot through this talk, right? It's like quite important that people are aware of that this is a problem and can like have a lasting impact on your software delivery process and your testing process as well, right? But yeah, all of the other things that we've mentioned, make sure that your tests aren't dependent upon each other. Make sure you use mocks and stubs for external services. And yeah, basically any article that you're going to read that's oriented towards code for flaky tests, they're going to give you answers on what kind of tests you should write, what kind of code you shouldn't write, so that your tests won't be flaky in the end. I mean, you're not going to avoid them 100%, but it's important that you like minimize them from the start. Otherwise, later on, you're going to devote like, depending on the number of your flaky tests, months of engineering work, especially if you have a lot of dependencies, right?
Right. That makes sense. And this is from a personal curiosity. Do you think joint reviews would be of help while, you're doing a code review where QA and devs are both looping in at the same time and doing a joint review? What is your take on that from a flaky mitigation perspective?
From this perspective, it would make like total sense, right? For instance, I'm speaking from my experience, right? Usually developers see QA as this evil team that tries to destroy their code, and there's like a bunch of memes around it on this planet, right? But I think, QA gives you like another perspective. So as an engineer, you're focused on delivering that feature or solving a bug or whatever, right?
Right.
But it's the QA person or any other role that's oriented around this that gives you like that insight. So sometimes you don't think about something that the QA would think about.
Right.
And it's like this perspective that can like give you a boost. So yeah, of course, code reviews with QAs would definitely like help in this case, especially if you're like starting with an engineering team that's maybe, I don't know, a lot of, juniors and maybe 2 seniors or something like that. It would be like really beneficial to involve a senior QA in the code review process as well.
And that would be all the questions from my end. Thanks a lot, Bostjan, for joining us today and talking about flaky tests, which is so vague in nature, but yet we had such a crisp, to the point session. All thanks to you for taking your time out of your busy schedule and joining us. And for all those who are listening, you can subscribe to LambdaTest YouTube channel for more insightful XP series episodes like this one.
And of course, if anyone wants to try out the dashboard that I've shown, feel free to sign up at Semaphore, test out our CI/CD, and also test out the Flaky test dashboard that we have.
Yeah, and
I'm available on social networks, and we'll have the description down below, right?
Yeah, you covered that part for me exactly, right? So we'll be sharing social. handles for Bostjan. Of course, you can find it in the description channel of the videos. And by all means, feel free to connect with Bostjan and me over LinkedIn if you have any further questions around this particular talk. And see you in the next episode of LambdaTest XP series, where we talk about the latest trends, innovations, and conversations from the world of testing and quality assurance. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This is Harshit and Bostjan with me, signing off. Until next time, happy testing.